As today is the first Sunday in February, we're going to take a look at what's happening with the Disney Company, and more importantly, what it means for the future of the parks, films, and other experiences. We'll look at how events happening today will reshape the company as it moves into the future. Elsewhere on our podcast, we are, of course, in the middle of a multi-part story about the Sherman brothers, two men who would be central to Disney's efforts in the 1960s, and we'll get back to that next week. But today, there's a lot to talk about. These are the updates and analyses for February 2022. Let's start with the big picture. The parks, the movies, the pandemic, and how all of these things are deeply related, and how recent events will remake how Disney presents itself in the near future. The Disney stock price started January at $156, but then with news of Omicron sank at one point down to $133 and recovered slightly by the month's end to $142. But with COVID continuing to affect theme parks, movie theaters, and other experiences, the general direction of the stock for the past year has been on a downward slide. 11 months ago, Disney stock was over 200. On January 19th, analyst Michael Nathanson of MoffettNathanson, who has followed the company for years, reduced its target price for Disney from $175 down to $165. Quote, "The COVID-19 pandemic has dealt the new CEO a very difficult hand," Nathanson said. He continued to explain that the pandemic has placed pressure on its key driver of growth, which is the parks. The pandemic impacted their largest source of immediate cash flow, which are their television networks such as ABC and ESPN, as it limited new content, sports in particular. It all but closed the creative center of Disney's business model, which are the films, as films generate characters for consumer products, spin-off TV shows, and attractions in the parks. Lastly, the pandemic has shifted the company to move more quickly to its direct-to-consumer streaming service, even as it struggles to develop enough new content to support that effort. In that same report, there was also positive news for some divisions of the Disney Company. Quote, "While there are clear headwinds in some of Disney's legacy businesses," said MoffettNathanson, "there are also strong tailwinds for the parks in both the near and long term." Despite current trouble, the report suggested that 2022 would be a transition year back toward higher levels of profits. Nathanson believed that the U.S. parks would reach $4 billion in earnings in 2022, which is slightly less than they made in 2019, the last non-pandemic year. Nathanson predicted continued growth in 2023 and 2024, but this mostly assumes that the current wave of COVID will be the last serious wave of the pandemic. Nobody has had a crystal ball through this pandemic. To put this in context, there are two main lines of thought about the next few months concerning COVID. First, that the sharp spike of Omicron will lead to a similar sharp decline, paving the way for a period of low infections over spring and hopefully into summer. But medical experts also point to a group of unknowns, specifically if a subvariant of Omicron, often referred to as stealth Omicron, might significantly slow the present decline, as this new variant appears to be even more transmissible than Omicron. MoffettNathanson appears to be in the former group, suggesting that spring and summer will be a better, though probably not a perfect, season for theme parks. To support this a little, in the past, MoffettNathanson has made some pretty good calls. Back in May 2020, when all of us were hunkered down at home and no theme parks were open anywhere in the U.S., MoffettNathanson suggested that this pandemic had the potential to be a long-term disruption. Quote, "There are a number of risks that could lead this unprecedented event to have a longer impact," they said, with earnings revisions massively skewed to the downside. Our Disney downgrade is also an admission that we believe the economic impact on the company will be longer than most anticipate, especially given the risks of a second wave of infections after reopening. How long specifically did they see the pandemic placing downward pressure on the stock? Again, back in May of 2020, they said, quote, We're also reducing our fiscal year 2022 forecast to factor in the additional risk and uncertainty about what a new normal will look like across most of Disney's businesses. That is, back in May of 2022, they thought this would last at least 2 years, if not longer. At the start of this year, January 2022, this same group saw continued trouble for some sectors of the Disney company, such as theatrical releases, but they believed that the parks would build back, with 2023 likely being the first truly normal year since the parks first closed 2 years ago, and this is what I think is the major takeaway. In this model, one of the most significant losses is that of film development. The eyes of the world have moved from the big screen down to the small screen. But products on the small screen, though lovely, often don't have the type of staying power necessary to impact culture over many months and create the type of lasting impressions that then can deeply support consumer products, publishing efforts, and perhaps, most importantly, attractions in the parks. With the exception of a couple of early made-for-TV specials in 1950 and 1951, Disney has been a regular player in the TV business since 1954. Shows made for the small screen are far more transient than those made for the big screen. If you think back over decades of Disney TV shows, it's hard to find shows that have made a lasting impact on the parks. Sure, the riverboats from Davy Crockett showed up at Disneyland once filming was finished. More recently, Phineas and Ferb had a World Showcase adventure at Epcot. Characters from various Disney TV channel shows appear at Hollywood Studios. And if you reach back a little ways, the Gummy Bears even appeared at Disneyland. But once these shows ended, so did the tie-ins at the parks. We've been conditioned to see TV, no matter how well it's developed, as something like a pleasant meal at, say, Panera Bread. We eat it, we enjoy it, and the next day we've mostly forgotten about it. Films we've been conditioned to see more like fine dining. When they're good, these meals we think about for days, if not years. If you've ever had a meal at Victoria and Albert's or Chico or Napa Rose, I bet you remember what you ordered, even if it was a few years ago. Film also lingers in the public conversation. A good film will play for many weeks, perhaps months, at the local theater. Next, it shows up on iTunes, then on physical media such as Blu-ray, and finally it comes to a streaming service. With this layered rollout, a strong movie can stay a focus of conversation for 6 months, maybe even a year. Think of Frozen or Endgame or Black Panther. However, when a film debuts on a widely accessed streaming service such as Disney+, it appears on everyone's TV on the same day, people watch it that week, and then mostly they move on. And that's one of the underlying issues beneath this creative shift from big screens to streaming. It's more difficult to connect with a wide audience in a way that would support a theme park attraction that then needs to hold a level of popularity for at least 20 years. Will Frozen Ever After, the ride at Epcot, have an audience for 20 years? I'm pretty sure it will. Would an attraction based on Encanto or Soul or Luca, all of which are excellent films, have an audience that would last 20 years? I don't think it would, partially because we as a culture have digested those properties so quickly. And I do realize that Encanto did start out in the theaters, but more on that in a moment. Though Disney has been very successful in moving its audience over to Disney+, the streaming service is also not accomplishing some of those larger goals of presenting characters and stories, which the company calls IP, in a way that they have an opportunity to take deep root in our culture. And this creates a problem of launching new properties that can support products and experiences in the parks. Ex-Disney CEO Bob Iger, in an interview with Kara Swisher released on January 27th, discussed how the pandemic changed the creative landscape for film production. He explained that COVID accelerated the trend away from the multiplex and toward home viewing. When asked if the pandemic would end cinema experiences, he said, quote, "I don't think it's the death. I think it's a severe injury that maybe doesn't heal. And what I mean by that is not fatal. It might be fatal to some. And here I take this to mean that he was suggesting that the public interest in film moving forward might not support the number of movie screens in the U.S. From there he said, quote, "I think that people will still want to go to the movies. However, they will be much more, I think, discerning about what movies they want to see out of the home, where you're likely, I think, to ask yourself, wait a minute, is this a movie I need to see on the big screen and do all that? Or can I just wait, or not even wait for that matter, and see it at home?" He pointed to Spider-Man, co-developed by Sony and Disney, as an example of the type of event movie that would drive theater business moving forward, but also suggested that many films that would have been released pre-pandemic to theaters would now premiere on a streaming service. Quote, "And so," he added, "I think what you're going to see is far fewer films being released for the big screen." And far fewer films for the big screen is a problem for the American cinema business. Spider-Man: No Way Home did bring a tremendous wave of viewers into theaters for the first time since March 2020. But surrounding Spider-Man were a group of well-reviewed films that did just middling to slow business, including West Side Story, Sing 2, and Scream. This will be a problem for the American cinema model overall, as the multiplex model is arranged to support multiple hit films at the same time. And then there's this other problem in terms of creating new films that feed consumer products, publishing, and theme park attractions. How do new animated films find long-standing connections with an audience when Disney is still supporting animated features that it made 30, 50, or even 80 years ago? Simply, are legacy animated films making it too difficult for new animated films to find a deep audience? For decades, Disney lived in an environment where it could expand its catalog of animated films with a reasonable expectation that many kids would be able to see all of them. When I was a kid, I saw both The Rescuers and Snow White, as well as most things in between. The Rescuers was Disney's 23rd animated film. Snow White was its first. But admittedly, there were a few animated films on this list, such as Victory Through Air Power, that Disney didn't have in a re-release schedule. So let's say that in practice, there were about 20 animated films on some type of re-release schedule, with very few animated features released from other studios. Now there are 60 animated features from Disney alone, with hundreds more released from other studios, including Pixar. At this point, to create a new animated film that will have a long-term cultural relevancy, it almost certainly means that some older film, such as Sword in the Stone, or perhaps maybe even Bambi, will need to fall away through either a lack of official support or through decreased viewings. Simply, there are only so many films people can see. Disney as a brand company is deeply invested in its legacy films. It's hard to imagine a Disney park without Snow White, Cinderella, Mickey Mouse, and Dumbo. These properties continue to be fresh sources for at least some attractions. The Seven Dwarfs Mine Train opened at the Magic Kingdom in 2014 based on a 1937 film. The new Dumbo section of Fantasyland opened at the Magic Kingdom with the Casey Jr. area in 2012, based on a 1941 film. In California, the Pooh Ride opened in 2003, based on characters first released by Disney in 1966. And in 2008, Disney reimagined the Sleeping Beauty walkthrough in the castle based on a film released in 1959. Not to mention all of the characters that appear daily in parades and greet areas, characters who, if they were real people, would now be on Social Security. In other words, Disney has a set of characters that have become part of the long-term cultural landscape, and that alone has tremendous value. And these characters and stories have become perennial sources of inspiration for park attractions developed over decades. Add into this one more element. Over the last dozen years, Disney has also created a string of live-action remakes of animated classics. This was done partially to introduce certain regions of the world, such as China and to a lesser extent India, to key Disney properties, as earlier animated films, when they were released, hadn't been shown there or hadn't been widely shown. Among the first was Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland. For those living in North America or Europe, this appeared to be a remake of a familiar animated fantasy. But for many in China, this was the first time they saw a Disney version of Alice. This plays out in the parks. In California, when you visit Disneyland, you mostly see the 1951 animated version of Alice in the ride, parades, and walking around. But when you visit Shanghai Disneyland, you're mostly presented with the Tim Burton live-action version of Alice. There's even an Alice in Wonderland walk-through maze, where the characters are modeled after the visual designs from the Tim Burton film. After Alice in Wonderland, there were other live-action remakes including Cinderella, Jungle Book, Beauty and the Beast, somewhat of a retelling of the Sleeping Beauty story through the perspective of Maleficent, The Lion King, Aladdin, and so on. All of them based on films that by then were at least 20 years old and in some cases much older, with an eye toward introducing a worldwide audience to Disney stories that were already known in North America, Europe, and some other regions. The latest in this series is a remake of the 1970s film The Aristocats, now being developed by the people who most recently worked on the Peter Rabbit films. These types of efforts even spill out into Disney Plus programming. The company is now developing an 8-episode live-action musical prequel for Beauty and the Beast, which takes place years before the events in the film and is primarily focused on a journey taken by Gaston and LeFou. As a side benefit, all of these projects also deepen the familiarity of these stories, or as executives would say, their brands, for those who regularly frequent the parks in the US, Europe, Hong Kong, and Japan. And this is by no means a bad thing. It increases the relevancy of legacy Disney properties, and from my own personal perspective, it also increases the public's awareness and even interest in hand-drawn animation, as an interest in the new live-action projects can make young people also interested in the original films. But a sustained interest in legacy films creates a cultural barrier for new films developing the same type of long-standing relevancy that has been enjoyed by The Little Mermaid, Peter Pan, Cinderella, and of course Snow White. And what Iger was saying last week to Kara Swisher, that more films would premiere on streaming services rather than in theaters, is only going to make it more difficult for new films to connect deeply with an audience in a way that will advance sequels and eventually lead to projects that support the parks. Full attractions that go into parks are often evaluated on a 20 or even 30-year cost-benefit analysis, with part of their overall tax value tied to a multi-year depreciation scale. If a film property isn't seen as having a deep audience for 20 years, there's very little chance that the company would invest in a project branded around its story for a theme park. And this issue is shaping up to be one of the hidden legacies of the pandemic. Franchise or series films like Toy Story and Cars, and universe films like Marvel and Star Wars will lend themselves to theme park attractions. But outside of that, how will Disney connect with an audience in such a way to create deep interest with new projects, such as with Frozen, if far more of its animated films, such as Luca, Soul, and Turning Red, are primarily viewed on small screens? I'd even group Encanto with an asterisk into this list. In the US, over its month-long theatrical release, Encanto made $93 million, which equates to roughly 10 million tickets sold. Over just its first week on Disney Plus in the US, it was viewed for 2.2 billion minutes, which is the equivalent of over 20 million full screenings of the movie. Assume that the average living room has 2.5 people watching the TV together, and that means that 50 million viewers saw Encanto during its first week on the streaming service versus the 10 million who saw it during its entire theatrical run. And certainly, there are some outside factors here. When Encanto was initially released on November 24th, the U.S. was seeing a very low number of new COVID cases. But just 3 weeks later, in mid-December, the U.S. was beginning to see a rise in Omicron infections that no doubt depressed ticket sales from that point forward. But still, those numbers tell a story of a film that was seen far more often on a streaming service than in a theater. And I know that many fans point to other options as the basis for theme park attractions, such as developing original properties, such as the Haunted Mansion and Pirates of the Caribbean. Neither of those, back when they opened, were based on a film. But one of the issues that is rarely discussed concerning these attractions is why Walt was developing so many non-film attractions in the 1950s. And sure, both Pirates and the Mansion opened in the 1960s, but their design work dates back to the 1950s. In the 1950s, Disneyland Incorporated was a separate company from Walt Disney Productions, as was WED. Disney characters did appear in Disneyland, but there were discussions about which characters and under what conditions they could appear. The character most associated with Disneyland in 1955 was Tinkerbell, which back then wasn't a central Disney character. If the park failed, then the character most tarnished wouldn't be someone like Mickey or Minnie. After the park opened, most designs for new rides had little to do with Disney animated characters. Among those projects floated for the mid-1950s included Liberty Street with an early version of the Hall of Presidents, Edison Square with an early version of the Carousel of Progress, New Orleans Square, International Land, and very early walk-through versions of the Haunted Mansion and the Pirates of the Caribbean. In the park, Walt was no doubt interested in expanding the type of experiences that the tools of Hollywood set design could replicate. But also, there's elements of practicality here too. These are all intellectual properties either based on history or developed by WED and therefore not owned by Walt Disney Productions. Even those attractions that opened in the mid to late 1950s were mostly developed without characters owned by Walt Disney Productions. Tom Sawyer's Island, the Monorail, the Matterhorn, Submarine Voyage, the Columbia, Grand Canyon Diorama, the Mine Train, and so on. The only attraction that deeply sticks out as fully IP-based is Alice in Wonderland in 1958. But by the mid-1960s and into the 1970s, after Walt Disney Productions purchased both WED and Disneyland, the parks became far more focused on film properties, even though the original Epcot Center for a while harkened a return to original properties. In fact, out in Florida, though there have been updates to existing non-IP attractions like Canada Far and Wide, the last major new ride to open without an IP tie-in, I think, was Expedition Everest in 2006. In terms of what the parks are now and how the public views them, they are mostly a set of lands that are deeply tied to screen experiences. And this is a concern when it comes to finding a path to develop long-standing interest in new films that will support the parks. And the issue has become even more complicated in the last few months. At the start of the pandemic, there was robust growth in streaming services, most notably Disney+, HBO Max, and Netflix. But in the last few months, this growth has slowed. In December, it was clear that the streaming pandemic bonanza was coming to an end. Netflix, the giant of the industry, was attracting fewer new subscribers than they had in recent quarters. On January 20th, Netflix announced that they missed their year-end target for new subscribers. The year-over-year increase was 8.3 million instead of the projected 8.5 million, bringing its subscriber base to 224 million worldwide. Much of the new growth is now outside of the US and Europe. Netflix also projected that subscriber growth for the next quarter would increase its base by only 1%. Even though the stock was already on a downward trend, hours after this announcement, the company lost another 20% of its value in after-hours trading. Over the next 5 days, it lost another 10%. Between November 17th and January 26th, the stock lost 48% of its value, though it has since recovered a little. But the slowdown in new subscriptions was viewed as an industry-wide problem, as it appeared it would be more difficult now to grow subscriber bases moving forward. On the same day that Netflix lost 20% of its value, Disney lost 7%. This summer, Disney Plus will launch in another 42 international markets, including Egypt, Poland, the UAE, and South Africa. Its original goal was to reach between 230 and 260 million subscribers by the end of 2024, essentially to become Netflix's main competitor. With a slowdown in subscribers, this looks now to be a difficult goal to reach. Beyond the numbers and all this, there's a difficult balancing act. Disney needs to fund programming for Disney Plus that is comparable to cinema quality. New subscribers will help pay for this. Disney also needs to release some films to theaters. But if Bob Iger is correct, these films will increasingly become large-budget spectaculars such as Star Wars, Marvel, Avatar, Indiana Jones, and so on. And Disney will likely need to find some way for part of its streaming content to connect with viewers so that it has a lasting impact on them over many years. This will be a complex shift to make and won't happen quickly, as it will require a change in how viewers relate to TV content, which is a shift I think that can be accomplished, but one that will take time. But to loop back to the main topic of this section, it would be this. Assuming Omicron follows the pattern of previous waves, March, April, and May should be fairly pleasant months to visit the parks with a far lower risk than we saw in late December and January. The Omicron wave has clearly crested. There should be a low period of infection in the near future, similar to the period after the Delta variant, in which a high percentage of Americans have a reasonable immunity due to vaccinations and recent infections. Personally, I might be a little more cautious now about summer and fall, as variants will continue to emerge, some of which might evade the protection of vaccines or cause reinfection. For my own part, I'm pretty optimistic about a better time in the months just ahead. But as this pandemic has caused disruption for 2 years now, it's spurred deep changes in our cultural viewing habits for films, which for decades have been the basis for many of Disney's other divisions, from publishing to consumer products to the parks. Films have created the stories that Disney uses elsewhere. And this shift, the partial drawdown of film and how it affects other divisions of the company, might take longer to correct than other problems stemming from the pandemic. In looking around the rest of the Disney company this month, I want to touch down on a few other areas. Though the California resort seems to be targeting spring and summer as the time to reopen more experiences, the Florida resort is moving in that direction now. Spring break is far more of a tourist draw at the Florida resort than in California, so there's a push to reopen more experiences before the spring break crowds arrive. Over at Hollywood Studios, the Fantasmic stage looks to be fully refurbished. The moat has been refilled, and when the show reopens, it will feature new show sequences keyed to Aladdin, Frozen, and Moana. There's no official reopening announcement. Also, I'm not aware of any rehearsals yet, but most of the physical structure now looks to be in place to move toward a reopening. Also out in Florida, 3 more restaurants have either reopened or are about to reopen. These are all signature offerings. Flying Fish over at Boardwalk reopened on January 27th. This is one of the 2 best seafood restaurants on property. On February 3rd over at Saratoga, the Turf Club and Bar reopened. Lastly, over at Jumbo House, Jico will reopen on February 17th. I'd easily place Jico, with its mix of African and Indian cuisine, as one of the 2 or 3 best restaurants at the resort. Not long ago, I talked with some of the staff and know the restaurant used the pandemic to upgrade many areas in the kitchen. I expect this to remain one of the top dining experiences at the resort. And to look at the larger picture of Disney World dining, the opening of these 3 restaurants is another step toward the dining plan returning. Disney World has been inching in this direction for months with some modified character meals and more signature restaurants. Though the reopening of the college program solved some of the restaurant's general staff shortages, Disney still faced shortages in kitchen areas. So much so, they are still offering hiring bonuses for skilled workers. Supply chain issues are also a problem for expanding out menus. We talked about both of these concerns in our last update. And though there is no solid news on a return of the Disney dining plan, the opening of 3 more restaurants adds capacity, which helps move the resort back to the point where it can support the dining plan. The dining plan doesn't always save guests money. It can if you research your options, but it's more often used as a way for guests to manage the cost of their visit by prepaying meals. With rising food costs, which then translates into rising meal prices, Disney should be incentivized to bring back this program when it has staff, surety of supply, and capacity in restaurants to support it, as the dining plan works as an incentive to bring guests concerned about in-park expenses to the resort. So I see movement in this direction, but as of yet, there's no announcement for the dining plan's return. Elsewhere, after nearly 2 years of closures, Disney World on February 6th will reopen 4 of their behind-the-scenes tours. 3 at Animal Kingdom, which are mostly outdoor experiences. They include Wild Africa Trek, Caring for Giants, and Up Close with Rhinos. Up Close with Rhinos, I think, is the best of the 3 experiences, but it's also the most difficult reservation to get, as it's limited to 1 group a day to correspond to zoological limits on animal interactions with guests. Over at the Magic Kingdom, the resort will also reopen the 5-hour Keys to the Kingdom tour, which, assuming it operates as it did before the pandemic, will move guests through both indoor and outdoor areas. As we've discussed in previous episodes, the current Lightning Lane capacity in Florida was not large enough for those wishing to purchase the Genie Plus service during the peak days after Christmas. In response, Disney is adding at least 3 Lightning Lanes for meet and greet experiences: the Celebrity Spotlight featuring Olaf at Hollywood Studios, and over at the Magic Kingdom, Town Square Theater featuring Mickey and Princess Fairytale Hall. This should better distribute overall demand for Lightning Lanes when crowds arrive in March. Outside the U.S., in Hong Kong, the Disney park is again closed due to COVID, this time through February 17th at least. In Paris, the Disney parks and Disney Village will now require a health pass in accordance with new government regulations for visitors over 12 years of age. This pass must verify one of 3 things: that a visitor is fully vaccinated, which for most people can include a booster; that a visitor has had a negative COVID test within the last 24 hours, or that a guest has been diagnosed with COVID within the last 6 months and due to antibodies is no longer considered to be infectious. Disney has an on-site testing center for those needing a COVID test, though the guests pay an outside provider for this service. The parks in Paris will essentially be treated like a closed cruise ship. It will be interesting to see how these regulations affect attendance in upcoming months. In France, 75% of the people have received 2 doses. 48% have received a booster, which is required for many to be considered fully vaccinated under the government's definition. So, will this healthcare requirement create a greater sense of public safety that increases overall attendance, or will this be seen as a barrier to attendance, as it will require many to receive a COVID test for each day they enter one of the parks? In terms of the cruise line, Disney has delayed the June 9th maiden voyage of the Disney Wish. The booking window opened last May for the 3-night maiden voyage, and available cabins filled quickly, as did cabins for many other cruises in summer 2022. But the new ship won't be completed on time, which has affected the first 12 sailings. Officially, this is blamed on supply chain issues related to COVID. Those who were booked on the June 9th maiden voyage have been automatically rebooked on the new July 14th maiden voyage with a 50% discount. Guests on the other early sailings will have their option of rebooking with a 50% discount or receiving a full refund. Until February 8th, Disney has paused new sales to guests on the Disney Wish, while those bumped from a previous sailing find a new date if they're interested in rebooking. In New York, as one might expect, ticket sales haven't been fabulous for Broadway shows in recent weeks. Along with other productions, the two remaining Disney shows on Broadway, Aladdin and The Lion King, now have 2-for-1 ticket sales. The promotion was set up to expire on February 13th, but has been extended now until February 27th. You'll need to use the coupon code BWAYWK, which is short for Broadway Week. I'll leave a link to the official ticket site and a copy of the coupon code down in the show notes. And lastly, in preparation for the Galactic Star Cruiser opening just next month, Disney is releasing a series of 5 comic books that outline the history of the ship. I've read the first, which was released last week. It's arranged as a story of a family who books passage on the Halcyon, the same ship that's at Disney World. Their visit then becomes an opportunity to retell some of the ship's history. I will say that if you're looking for depth in character and storyline, this may not be for you. But the art is lovely, and the panels present interior representation of some areas of the ship, as well as filling in its backstory and introducing some of the characters that will populate the Star Cruiser experience. If you're interested in a comic book preview of the Galactic Star Cruiser, you can find Halcyon Legacy Issue 1 at comic book shops, or it's a $5 Kindle download over on Amazon, which is where I got my copy. For this too, in the show notes, I'll include a link to Amazon. And that brings us up to date with news and analysis for where the Disney company is going in February 2022. I'll be back next Sunday with a new episode that continues the story of the Sherman Brothers, 2 songwriters who defined much of the Disney sound during the last years of Walt's life. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. If you are a regular listener, if you click in most weeks to see what's happening, you can support this podcast by becoming a monthly subscriber over on Bandcamp. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes. But the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.